All right, welcome back from lunch. We have Jason Kichen talking on hashes to ashes, clandestine infrastructure. Give him a warm welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, all right. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. I have the lucky position of the after lunch speaker on the last day, so I know we're all tired and sleepy. So we'll keep this interesting and moving. So cool. So as the introduction said, I'm Jason Kichen, presenting Hashes to Ashes, the life and times of clandestine infrastructure. So what are we going to do? I'll do the obligatory who am I. I'll tell you who I am, what I've done, and why you should be listening to anything I'm saying and why I'm even standing up here at all. I'll talk about what infrastructure is and what I mean when I say the word infrastructure, because we all know what infrastructure is, but I mean something pretty specific here. I'll talk about how requirements breed complexity. We'll do a quick step-by-step and what it actually means to build this stuff and use it. We'll talk about doing that at scale. We'll talk about what happens when things go really bad and there's a compromise. And then finally, we'll have a real-world example that we can look at what happens when it happens for real. So, who am I? As the title slide said, I'm currently the VP for Advanced Security Concepts at a company called Ecentire. We're a managed detection and response company based in Toronto. I know most of those words are just a random assortment of buzzwords that don't mean a whole lot. But what really matters for the presentation is that I spent about 15 years as an intelligence officer in the US intelligence community, building, managing, running, executing offensive cyber and tech operations all over the world, both remote and not so remote. And there's a difference there, and it's important to understand that because it becomes relevant in a little while. Like the movies will show you, and like we all like to imagine sort of nation-state hackers, we're all sort of doing everything remote, right? So you can throw an exploit, access a network, do a thing, do a lot of cool stuff from 5,000 miles away from the comfort of your armed guard building somewhere in the Washington, D.C. metro area. You can do it in shorts and flip-flops and a T-shirt, and at 5 o'clock you go home and hang out with your spouse and your dogs, and everyone's happy, safe, and content. But there's a reality in which, though, that's not possible, right? Where the network or the computer or the phone or the person or the thing that you're trying to access is not remotely accessible no matter where it's located. And maybe it's because the network or the thing is air-gapped, so you can't get to it remotely at all. Maybe it's because the hardware and the software is up to date and fully patched, and I can't do anything to gain any access to it at all. And I have to do something a little bit more clever. I have to do something to gain access to the thing that I'm supposed to gain access to. And in those scenarios, there's a couple of things that you end up doing or that we ended up doing, right? So one is that maybe you have to get closer physical proximity. So in that scenario, at least in the early part of my career, it was me, and later part of my career, other people. But you put on a stupid disguise, you have a backpack with a bunch of gear in it, and you go wander around the courtyard of an office building or around some building in some city, or maybe around the mud-walled walls of a compound in Afghanistan or something like that, right? So physical proximity to try to gain some sort of technical access. But maybe proximity isn't enough. Maybe we need to get someone to do something for us. So maybe I need someone to plug a thumb drive into a computer for me to enable my access, or change a setting on a firewall, or open a port, or give me credentials, or get me an IP address, or something, right? But I can find a human being that I can find ways to convince that person to do a thing for me and help me enable my access, right? So those are the two types of things we're talking about, sort of remote accesses like that and not so remote accesses. I thought this GIF was the most appropriate way to show what I did for about 3.5% of my career. Working for the government as an intelligence officer can be very exciting, and sometimes it looks like that. Unfortunately, it normally looks like this, and for those who can't read it, it basically says we're going to blue sky some ideas and parking lot some ideas, because this is mostly what government service looks like, right? It's lots of meetings, lots of paperwork, lots of email. It's lots of meetings with lawyers, which are followed by more meetings with lawyers, and then when that's done, you have another meeting with lawyers, and then when the next week starts, you start that over again and have more meetings with lawyers. So that's usually what that stuff actually looks like. So, infrastructure. How many of you folks are pen testers, red teamers, adversary emulation types? Just a handful. Fantastic. All right, well, some of this will ring pretty true to you, but some of it will be new. So when I use the word infrastructure, what I mean is that if I'm the attacker, in this case the guy at the red computer, and I'm going after a target, the thing at the blue computer, everything in between those two, right? My attack workstation here, my target on the other side, all that stuff between is the infrastructure, right? It's stuff that I either own or I control or I have otherwise access to that I'm using to enable my technical operation. And why am I doing that, right? What are the reasons for this infrastructure? Well, there's two main ones. The main one, which we all sort of make sense to all of us, is that I want to do the thing I'm going to do and I don't want to get caught. And more importantly, if I get caught, I don't want to get attributed, right? Attribution, if you're a state nexus actor, is the worst possible thing in the world, right? It's bad enough if you get caught and you get burned and you lose things, But if the person who caught you says, oh yeah, it was Bob sitting in this building in this country for this thing, that's a really bad day. So the part of this infrastructure is designed so that I can do all the things that I'm going to do and all the ways that I'm going to do it, but that if I were to get caught, that when the security IT guy on the other side looks at the logs and sees a log line and sees a source IP address, that source IP address doesn't belong to the US government and a US government-owned IP block, and it geolocates to Washington, DC, right? So that infrastructure sits there to make sure I don't get caught, and if I do, I don't get attributed. It's also there because I need to get my packets from red to blue, right? I got to get stuff back and forth. I need bidirectional communications here, sometimes at very high volume, sometimes at low volumes, sometimes at very high frequency, and sometimes at very low frequency. But I need to pass stuff back and forth, and oftentimes from where I'm sitting, I can't just send packets directly to the thing that I care about. I need something to enable that transit, and I have infrastructure to do that, right? But the main overriding concern here is that I can do it without getting caught, and if I get caught, I can't get attributed. So there's a lot of terminology for this infrastructure, and some of you red teamers or pen testers might use the same terminology, right? But there's a lot of things, a lot of words you can use to describe it. You'll hear midpoint, hot point, proxy, redirector, operational relay box, or ORB. There's a lot of terms to be used. I'm going to use proxy and redirector or redirection sort of interchangeably, but bottom line is it's a machine that sits between you and the target that you're pivoting traffic through or proxying traffic through. Unfortunately, it's usually not this easy. There's a lot more nuance and complexity that goes into it. Now, if you're a red teamer and you have an engagement, and that engagement is scoped very tightly, you set up infrastructure that is at the bare minimum needed to enable your engagement, right? Because infrastructure is expensive, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of effort, and no one really wants to worry about it, right? It's the boring part of cyber operations, right, or red teaming, or even state nexus operations, the infrastructure side, right? Setting up servers and VPSs and all that jazz. No one cares, because all we want to do is like throw exploits and put implants down and get command and control and all the fun stuff that everyone really wants to care about. But there is a boatload of complexity that goes into it because the ramifications of doing it wrong or doing it poorly are really, really serious, right? And we'll talk about what some of that can look like. So here's our same diagram again, but this time we've inserted something into it. We've inserted another machine, right? So what have I done here, right? Well, I guess at the most basic level, I have sort of bidirectional communications between me and my target, and now I have a machine between me and my target. So now that I have some sort of maybe misattribution or maybe something that disconnects from me directly to my target. So that makes some sense. But we can see that, coming from the attack workstation, there's two distinct paths, but coming out of the target network, there's really kind of one path, but some of it passes through this one machine. But maybe we can get a little bit more complicated, right? So now in this scenario, I've got multiple layers of redirection between myself and the target. And more importantly, coming out of the target space, I've got a bifurcated sense of data flow, right? So we can see coming out of that blue machine, my target, I have two distinct machines there. Maybe one is for command and control, right? So low volume, maybe low latency. And maybe one is for exfiltration of data, right? Super, super high volume at some set schedule. But I've split my traffic going over multiple mediums, and now I have these other layers that sit between on the other side as well, so that if I'm the attacker sitting at the red machine, I never even touch the machines that touch the source network or the target network, right? I've put multiple layers between me. Because what really ends up happening here when you get caught, right? So there's some enterprising young IT or security person sitting at that blue computer who's trolling through their logs late on a Friday night, and they find something interesting, right? Something that doesn't look right. And it's got a source IP address that comes out to be, like OVH or some random like cloud provider somewhere in the world. Well, they don't really know what that is, right? Some cloud thing, doesn't make a lot of sense. But they know a guy at OVH. So that enterprising young IT person calls a friend at OVH and says, hey, I found this thing. I see this traffic. It's coming from an IP in your range, in your cloud, in your infrastructure. Can you help me understand what it is? And of course they do, right? Because that's the way that the security and IT world works, is that we all know each other, we're friends, we're in Slack groups, we're in trust groups. So we reach out and talk to each other to try to figure out what is this thing that I'm seeing. And even if your NDAs don't allow it, and even if your policies don't allow it, that information gets shared back and forth. But if I'm the attacker here, I've put multiple layers in here. So even if that young analyst has figured that out, maybe they can peel back the onion one layer, right? But they can't really get to me. Make sense so far? Head nods mostly? Cool. All right. So maybe it gets a little bit more complicated, right? So this version of the world, pretty simplistic, right? And I've seen red teams do this exact thing, right? Very, very well. But the reality of a state nexus operation where you have multiple streams of information, you have long-term clandestine access where you really, really don't want to get caught, is that you put a whole lot of complexity in your infrastructure, both to drive your operation towards success and to make sure you don't get caught. So let's look at this one in a little bit more detail, right? So we can see sort of the remnants of the previous thing. We still have those 2 computers here and 2 computers on the other side of my weird cloudy thing. But there's a lot of other weird stuff on the other side. So one thing, the last time I showed this slide to some other person, and the first thing they said was, what's with the phone? Right, because that thing is supposedly a phone over there. Why is there a phone and a tower and then another can be like, how does that have anything to do with this? Right, so infrastructure, when we talk about that, again, was just all the machines we put between us and the target. It doesn't matter if it's a computer or a laptop or a phone or a VPS or a thing that I've rented or a thing that I've bought or a router that I've popped or whatever the thing is, it's a thing on the internet that I can push traffic through and receive traffic through. In this case, maybe it's a phone. And we can start thinking about what was the nature of this access or this target that required me to use a phone for something. Well, the problem with phones, of course, is that it's hard to put a lot of data through them, and it's on a cellular network, and it's probably some like third world 2G network, so I can't put a whole lot of data through it at all, but I can put a little bit, maybe just enough for command and control, right? Maybe enough to put a beacon through it, or maybe to pass a trigger packet through it, just enough that I can control whatever my implant is. The next question becomes, how did you get on the phone in the first place, right? How did you realize the phone was there and get on the phone and then use the phone as part of this operation? Well, what I likely did was that I know what my target is, right? Acme Inc., the blue computer over there on the left-hand side. I look on LinkedIn and I find the 15 people who work at Acme Inc., and then I looked at their Facebook profiles and their Twitter profiles and their LinkedIn profiles, and I worked through all this magic to figure out that this particular person that works at this company has a phone of a particular type because they're posting pictures from it on Instagram. I look at the time and dates of their postings, and I can see that they're posting things to their social media accounts during normal working hours, so they probably have their phone in their office with them. I can look at company hiring policies and realize they probably have a bring your own device policy, so this device is coming into the office environment, probably connecting to the Wi-Fi. I could probably figure out what this person's email address is, so maybe I can spearfish them at home, get them to click a link, put an implant on the phone, wait for them to carry the phone to into the office, connect the phone to the Wi-Fi, pivot out the command and control of that beacon or of that implant on the phone, out through the corporate Wi-Fi, and back to me, right, all the way through that convoluted way. So from target network to phone to tower to multiple layers of redirection, and then finally back to me. So that again, in the worst case scenario, if that enterprising young IT analyst figures something out, they're not going to figure out much, right? They're going to figure out a phone maybe, but that trail is going to pretty much end right there. But we can see there's a bifurcated data flow coming out of that source network, right? We have another arrow going down to what looks like some sort of Wi-Fi router device, right? So maybe I'm doing command and control through the phone because, again, it's super low bandwidth, but I need to exfiltrate gigabytes of data from the network, right? Design files, Word documents, email, whatever it may be. I can push that through something like a network device or a Wi-Fi device, right? That's an easy way to get out of the network. So I push all my data out through there, and I have a whole other separate chain of redirection between that exfiltration path and my attacker workstation, right? So again, multiple layers between them. And then I have this weird thing at the bottom here with a bunch of random servers in it and a long slinky line. Maybe this is my exploitation infrastructure, so that as I'm spearfishing the crap out of the guy sitting on the blue thing, they're getting links, and when they click those links, they get redirected to exploitation infrastructure, and that's all sitting down here, and that's entirely separate, right? That's outside of all of this design. There's a lot of devices in here, right? There's a lot of complexity in all of this. And it doesn't come together overnight. It comes together over a long period of time. It's built by an army of people. It's maintained by an army of people. And a lot can go wrong, right? And we'll talk about what that looks like. Who knows what movie that's from? Come on. What? Louder? Sneakers? Yeah, Sneakers. Oh, thank God. I was worried that the crowd would be too young and be like, what is this thing that you're showing? Cool, so that's from Sneakers. For those who haven't seen it, right, one of the best hacker movies ever made. So this is the scene where Whistler and the team, they want to call the director of the NSA, because that's a thing you do apparently. So they want to make this phone call, but they don't want to get caught, right? So the line or the script goes something like, we're going to bounce this call through so many places around the globe that NSA could never trace it. So they pick up the phone, they make the call, and there's this fantastic visual of which I have no idea how it would ever work in reality, but this visual of the NSA tracing the call through all the various hot points that the call is being routed through, right? The reason why I like this and I made this is that it's about the best visual representation of clandestine infrastructure ever, right? Because it's literally what's happening, right? It's traffic being bounced through multiple points around the globe in various ways so that the end point, in the case of the movie, it's the director of the NSA on a call, but whoever the target is can't trace backwards, right? That's the whole idea of the whole thing. Now this one's got multiple hops, kind of like the diagram I was showing before, but the level of complexity that you need there, right, how much you need to do, how many layers, how many of these hop points do you need between you and the target, is just based upon the nature of the operation you're trying to do. Sometimes maybe you only need something as basic as this, right? There will be operations, given the target, the nature of it, where it is, what it does, that this will suffice. There are times when this will suffice. There are times when this will suffice. And there are times when 5x this becomes what you really need to do. So let's talk about how you get there, right? What does that determination actually look like? Anybody from Peru? Going once? So the reason I use Peru is that it's the least controversial example of a nation state that I can use, right? So I could use Russia or China, and then someone's like there's a cringe factor there because it's in the news and there's a lot of stuff. But with Peru, there's no diplomatic or military spat between the US government and Peru right now. So it's a relatively safe bet. So we're going to use Peru as our example. So let's say I'm going to be designing a cyber operation against a target in Peru. So what's the first question we ask? Well, what is the target, right? What are we trying to go after? So maybe it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or maybe it's an economic production thing, or like a State Department sort of thing, or maybe it's a weapons manufacturing facility, right? Let's go with weapons manufacturing facility. That's an exciting target, right? So we want to gain technical access to the weapons manufacturing facilities network because we want to pull down engineering diagrams of the weapons that they're building, right? Seems like a reasonable target. Cool. Are there CI or attribution risks? So CI is not continuous improvement, it's counterintelligence. Are there CI or attribution risks, right? So now this is Peru, but let's imagine maybe in another scenario that the country in which my target is ruled by a despotic leader that were they to discover the United States or any other country having technical access to the network of an organization that they would deem critical infrastructure, like a weapons manufacturing facility, they might consider it an act of war. Right, so that they discover implants down on target, they discover the command and control, they decide it was country X, they decide to do a kinetic response against country X, right, drop bombs. Seems kind of far-fetched, is an entirely possibly real scenario that is debated all the time, right? So are there attribution risks like that? If we get caught, what does the host country think about the thing that we've done? Are there CI risks or other risks? Well, what tools and equities do I use? Tools, infrastructure, and exploits. If I get caught, do I lose those things? Well, that could be bad. It depends on what I had to use, right? Was it an air-gapped network that was super hard to gain access to and I used billion-dollar implants to do it? Well, if so, I'm going to be pretty pissed if I lose those things, right? So I'm going to be cognizant of that risk. Did I have a human being help me with this, right? Did I pay someone to plug a thumb drive in, or to change a configuration on the firewall, or open a port, or give me credentials, or set an IP address for me? If I did that, and I get caught, does that person get also caught and arrested and thrown in jail, or disappear and never to be seen from again? Right? These are totally non-technical related questions, but very directly relevant from a state nexus actor's perspective when you're talking about designing and executing an operation with what particular infrastructure. So I've answered those two questions. I come up with what kind of infrastructure do I need, right? So how many layers of redirection, for example, or what kind of machine should they be? Should they be bought or rented or leased or compromised? So do I go out and I just buy a bunch of computers somewhere else in the world in someone's data center and I push traffic through that? That's an option. Do I stand up virtual nodes inside someone's cloud infrastructure and I push things through that? That's an option. Do I compromise other people's machines, desktops or routers or other stuff around the world and I push traffic through that? That's an option. Which one do you choose? Well, it's a combination of all of them. Right? That's what you end up with. This diagram, that diagram is all three of those, right? There's rented, there's leased, there's purchased, there's compromised, there's all sorts of stuff in there. Again, the goal of that being that if you're the guy on the blue side and you're trying to track this back, you're going to run into problems, right? You're not going to be able to get through all those various layers of all those various types. So we make some decisions, what we're going to buy, what we're going to rent, what we're going to lease, what we're going to own. And then we have to get it and set it up and provide it to somebody. So this is the really boring part, right? Someone's got to go out and get an account and set up infrastructure and make sure it works and spend a few days configuring IP tables because it takes a few tries. And they go through all the things and they get the credentials set up and they get all the details. And when they're done with that, they give it to someone else to test it, right? So this is a pretty key component. When you see threat intelligence firms doing reporting on nation-state actors or state nexus actors or various APTs or Fuzzy Snuggly Duck or Cozy Bear, or whatever the naming conventions are these days. When you see that reporting and they talk about infrastructure, the key to remember is that there's a team of people in that actor responsible for creating that infrastructure. The operators aren't doing it. There's not like a guy in the back of the room doing it or like a weird broom closet where the IT guy sits and he does it. There's a team of folks of a potentially large size whose job it is to get it, set it up, configure it, test it, make sure it works, and maintain it over time. So that team or army of people does that thing. They test it, and then they give it to the person who actually has to use it, right? The person on keyboard, the operator, the hacker, the super elite guy. So now that guy gets to use the infrastructure, right? Push traffic through it, get command and control, exfiltrate data, do all the cool things, win, get an award, get a big certificate, get some time off, get some extra money, retire with a medal, go on to be a big consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton. This is recorded, isn't it? Whoops. So then there's the last box, O&M, right? So operations and maintenance, for those who don't know what O&M is. This is the hard part of the whole thing, right? So if infrastructure is like logistics, O&M is like the person responsible for buying the bread in the logistics, right? For the caravan of soldiers. Even once you get it, you make all these decisions, right? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to get it? Let's get it set up. Let's get it configured and test it, and then give it to the guy who's going to use it. The real challenge now is I have to maintain it over time. It doesn't just like, well, it's good to go, knock yourself out, and I'm going to go home for the day. Instead, I have to make sure it keeps working, right? I have to make sure that the machines stay up and available, that I can ping them, that they're even available to me, that they're updated, the software is running, that the credentials are good, that I apply updates and patches as needed, that I'm cognizant of where they are and what's going on in that part of the world, so that if I've got a machine in a data center in Nairobi, that if there's a coup in Nairobi and they're burning data centers to the ground, I need to be cognizant of that piece of information. That O&M part's really hard, right? This is where the failure comes in. This is where, in so many compromises, when infrastructure gets rolled up in that compromise and that infrastructure exposes the natures of the operations, it's usually because the O&M fails, right? Someone forgot to register the domain again when it expired, and then some security company goes out and sinkholes the domain, right? And we starts unraveling the whole thing. Or certs start expiring and things don't work anymore, and there's blue screens and all sorts of crazy stuff starts happening. So this is sort of an overall sense of that process. But it's really hard to do at scale, right? So good actors can do stuff like this once, maybe twice, certainly not multiples at the same time. The really, really good actors, right, the good state nexus actors that do this stuff do 100 of those at any given moment. Right, all over the world with various equities at play, various types of exploits and implants, various brands or breeds of infrastructure, some where you have technical access that is entirely remote, some where you have humans involved, some where you're doing crazy off-the-wall things to get that access. The challenge is doing it at scale. And that's really what ends up separating sort of the large state nexus actors that are really, really good at this from the rest of the state nexus actors that are okay at it, and then everyone else beneath that, right, is doing it at scale, repeatedly, at the same time, over and over and over again, and ideally not failing when you're doing it. Part of the problem of doing it at scale is you need available stock, right? None of this, or very little of it, is just in time. A lot of it is that we need to gain access to a thing. I have the access now, or I have the person who's going to help me make the access now, or I've got the IP address now, I need to do it. Where's my infrastructure? It's not as if, well, I guess we have to go get infrastructure now, so we kick off the process and have a meeting and fill out paperwork. I mean, you could do all that. But the reality is you need this stuff available to you. So you have to have a warehouse of infrastructure available. You have to have all these rented machines, all these compromised machines, all these pieces at various stages of stock so that when that time comes, you can put it all together and package it up and give it to the person who's going to use it and it's ready to go with as minimal changes as you possibly can. But that's really, really hard to do, right? Unfortunately, the nature of sort of state nexus operations is that every operation you're doing is the most important thing that's going on at that given moment, right? It's not easy to be like, well, this thing's cool, but it's number 4 on my list. Everything is the highest priority 1, right? And if everything is priority 1, nothing is priority 1. But everything is really important, so I have to have this stuff at stock or in stock and ready to go. Most importantly, everything links to everything. This is where things tend to fail really quick, right? So let's say you have that team of people doing the O&M, and that team's job includes things like registering domains. If you put 5 people in a room for 3 years straight and their job is to register the malicious domains that you're going to be using for your operations, imagine the patterns that start to unconsciously emerge from the nature of that work, right? So let's say these 5 people happen to be Rick and Morty fans. And when they're sitting at work every day and they're doing work and they talk about Rick and Morty a lot because they like Rick and Morty. But you end up with domains that unconsciously have Rick and Morty-like themes to them. Now, the 5 people don't realize that, right? Because it's entirely subconscious, and you don't really realize it's happening because you're not doing it on purpose. But the security company, threat intelligence, all the people on the outside that are looking for these things to try to find these things pick up on those patterns really, really quickly, right? Because they're looking for those patterns to try to identify how these domains, for example, that don't seem to be linked to each other from a technical standpoint, all share a common naming convention or a common theme in the number of letters or the words that they use or the types of information that are in the domains, right? So those patterns start to unconsciously emerge. It's really hard to do. So you end up in scenarios like this, right? So 4 years ago, we had an operation. We used an implant, Operation Drunk Koala or what have you. It used a C2 node that was a rented VPS somewhere in the world. That C2 node was purchased with a fake ID, right? Fake driver's license or a fake ID for whatever country it's in, and using a fake credit card or some other sort of financial instrument to acquire it. Let's say something gets wrapped up, right? Something happens, some piece of that. I have to go all the way back and figure out where does that one thing link. So those 5 domains, for example, that those 5 people created over the last 6 months that all tend to blend together, they now all link together such that if any one piece of an operation gets compromised, right, I blue screen a box, some antivirus pops a flag somewhere, that enterprising young analyst works late on a Friday and finds something in the logs and decides to chase it down. If that happens, I now, as the person burned, have to go back and do this process of like, well, that piece of infrastructure that just got caught or that implant was used in these other 37 operations, and those 37 operations used all of this infrastructure, and all of that infrastructure used this fake credit card or this fake identification or used this particular provider. And now I have to walk that back 2, 3, 5, 10 degrees and start making assumptions or start making decisions about where do I burn stuff, right? How far back in that chain do I burn the things I've been using because they're about to get caught? There's no obvious answer to that. It's every time this happens, you have to figure it out. And then ultimately, it's getting harder because ID and payment verification gets harder, right? It's to the point where you're having to make copies of ID and fax it in or get on the phone and do voice verification. And if you're an entity that is trying to stay clandestine and undercover and not expose yourself or your voice, doing that verification can get pretty hard. And then things go bad. Things go really bad, right? So in a perfect world, if you're going to get compromised, if your operation is going to get blown and you're going to get caught, you want to have a heads up that it's going to happen, right? You want to know, right? Because I want to pre-burn all my infrastructure, and I want to remove all my implants, and I want to get anyone who helped me in the operation who's in country out of harm's way and flown out as quickly as possible. But it never really works that way, right? It doesn't work that well. Unfortunately, what usually happens is that the first time you become aware of a compromise is when the report hits the press, right? You see it on CNN, or you see it on Slashdot, or you see it in some trust group, and someone mentions something in there. And this is where the process gets really dicey, right? And every state nexus actor has to ask this question, but they all answer it a little bit differently, right? And it's about risk tolerance. It's about what you're really willing to tolerate. There are some state nexus actors in the countries from which they work and the governments that they support that don't care so much about getting caught and care even less about compromise, right? Because their position is like, meh, no one's going to do anything about it. So if we get caught, we get compromised, who cares? I'm not really worried about it. There are others who all that matters is not getting caught in compromise, right? Every piece of the operation, its design is built on how do I not get caught and how do I not get compromised, because it's the worst possible outcome. And then there's the actors that fall somewhere in between. The reality, of course, is that it's not the same for every actor every time. And this is where we fall into a lot of traps, or at least cognitive biases, with the Russians and the Chinese, for example, and the types of operations they run, where people have been starting to say things like, they obviously don't care about getting caught because they get caught and they just keep doing it, or they get caught and they use the same infrastructure for the next operation 6 months later, the same email address registering for the same domain or the same spear phishing content, right? So it seems like they don't care. The reality is that they probably do, but they do at a very tactical level, right? So this operation, if it gets caught, how do I respond or how much do I care? But this operation over here might be so sensitive in so many ways that I do care if this one gets caught. So it's not a uniform thing based on the nature of the actor. It's a non-uniform thing based on the nature of the operation and then the sort of MO of the actor themselves, right? How they look at this problem and how they approach it. But the process is the same in all those scenarios, right? No matter the actor. What is the thing that got burned? Is it an implant? Is it an acquisition capability? Is it a person? Is it an IP address? Is it an infrastructure provider? and you build out a web from that, right? So you go 1 degree out, and then 2 degrees out, and 3 degrees out, and so on and so on and so on, until you reach a point where you have sort of gone from the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. I've gone from the single individual point in the middle all the way out to I've now linked the nature of my compromise to the leader of the country, right? It's totally ridiculous, but you can get there relatively quickly. And then you start making determinations about what do we burn, what do we get rid of. And that question, that answer, comes down to what are you willing to lose? Right? Because if I don't burn something that's been compromised or maybe linked to something that was compromised, I put at risk that thing, right? The infrastructure, how I acquired it, the implant, the exploit, whatever is involved here. If I do burn it, then I can't ever use it again, but I'd really like to use it again, right? It was good for me, I don't want to really get rid of it. But where do you take that risk? If I say this implant has been burned now, I can never use it again. What about the other 150 operations that use that implant? Do I get rid of those operations? Do I switch out the implants in those operations? But if I switch out the implants in those operations, doesn't that clue in to those targets that something's gone wrong, right? Because now I'm making changes, and if they're watching, then something really bad is happening. So these are really, really complex questions that are really hard to answer. So, speaking of Rick and Morty, it did go really bad for somebody lately. And we could talk about that, because it's pretty cool. Anybody work for Cisco Talos in the room? Not Cisco generally, but Talos specifically? Threat intel people? Come on, raise your hand. No? Okay. So, Talos, for those who don't know, is Cisco's in-house threat intelligence team, and they're super cool, super good. I have massive respect for them. They did this almost a year to the day. I mean, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of VPN filter being announced. So who remembers VPN filter? Yeah, a couple people, right? Not as many as it's okay. So VPN filter was a really, really cool thing. This was one of the most interesting things that's happened from my perspective since I left the government in the spring of 2017. So Talos comes out almost a year ago now with this report, including this graphic, and said, holy shit, there's this thing that's been going on. We've been working with other threat intel providers in the space to figure out what it is secretly. We haven't told anybody. But we think things have reached a level where something bad's about to happen, so we're going public now. Earlier than we wanted to, but we're doing it now. So what did they find, right? So they found this thing called VPN filter, which is more or less a 2-stage piece of malware with various modules that sits on, for the most part, routers like Soho devices, and then some network-attached storage devices like Synology or QNAP or whatever. But for the most part, things like D-Links and MikroTiks and stuff like that, right? Soho devices, home routers and whatnot, or small business stuff. So this malware is on there, and it does a bunch of different things, and the graphic does a pretty good job of walking through what it is and how it works. But Talos pointed to a few different things in their analysis. So the first was that there was a module that was capable of intercepting or monitoring for Modbus traffic, right? So for those who are in the industrial control and SCADA world, Modbus is a protocol that's used to talk to industrial control devices. So it was capable of looking at that sort of data, right, which was interesting. And there was a destructive capability, and that destructive capability was with a single command, the operator of the malware could remotely wipe the device that the malware was sitting on. Now remember, it's sitting on like a Soho device, right? Like basic Linux file system. We're not talking about like a Windows 10 machine or something. So like wiping that device is not terribly hard to do, right? And the nature of the access that the malware had was very, very simple to do that. So pretty interesting. So DHS put out an advisory on this. I don't remember that one. So DHS, anyone from DHS in the room? So DHS came out and said, like, everybody, reboot your routers. Which wasn't, to be fair, the worst advice, right? Because the stage 1 thing lived in memory only, so if it was on your device and you rebooted your router, it booted the stage 1 off. Doesn't mean it couldn't be reinfected, right? But it was a good thing. Stage 2 was not in memory, so it wouldn't have done anything. So it wasn't the worst advice, but telling the American populace writ large to reboot your router is not necessarily the most productive guidance to be giving people. But it was a start. Cool, so monitor for Modbus traffic, interesting, and destructive capability. So what was this, right? So in the report, Talos used the word infrastructure and talked about this being infrastructure related a couple of times, right? They definitely gave credence to that particular theory and wrote about it and talked about it. What's interesting about the destructive capability, or how that came into why they exposed it when they did, right? So there's a graph in the report that shows how, like, in the days before they released it publicly, there was a spike in infections from VPN filter in Ukraine. And that terrified Talos and their partners, right? Because obviously Ukraine has served as sort of an industrial control attack playground for a couple of years for a couple of actors, maybe just one. And to see this thing that can monitor for Modbus that had destructive capabilities spiking in infections in Ukraine was pretty scary to Talos, which is a reasonable point, right? A totally reasonable assertion with the concern that maybe they're going to destroy something. So in that scenario, they went public with their partners and released the whole thing. But what really was the destructive capability, right? So I would surmise that it wasn't destructive from the nature of we want to literally destroy machines, right? Like it's a destructive attack. It was destructive because as infrastructure, right, as a way to pass traffic to enable your other operations, you need to be able to burn your infrastructure, right? Because if you get to the point of compromise where you have to burn your infrastructure, I want a quick and expedient way to do that. Here's a super quick and expedient way to burn my infrastructure. Now, it burned the device it was sitting on, which is a little bit of a blunt instrument, but maybe that's the Russian MO in this case, right, which was the hypothetical actor behind VPN filter. Maybe that's okay, right? But at the end of the day, yes, it's malware. Yes, it's an implant. Yes, it's really interesting. I mean, super interesting. But it was part of a global infrastructure setup so that other Russian operations, by whatever actors, doesn't really matter, could do their operations against other targets, right? And this thing was all over the world. I don't remember the actual number, but it was hundreds of thousands of devices over the world were seemingly infected with this thing. That's a lot of infrastructure that you could push traffic through. So there's a use case, or at least an incident, where some guys I know that work in a SOC were working, monitoring a customer, and the customer got compromised. And they found, the EDR platform found the malware and found the implant, or at least the processes involved with the implant, and identified the command and control that was going on to do things and block the command and control. And the customer, of course, was concerned, right? The customer was worried because, like, oh, this is not good. And in interactions with the customer asked the obvious questions, right? So what data left the network? And of course, the answer was, well, we found the command and control, right? Or the analyst found the command and control. Right, but what data left the network? And the customer didn't quite realize that those are not the same things, right? Remember back from this one, or that one maybe, right? There are bifurcated paths out the network, right? The threat actor doesn't want to get caught and wants to make sure that they don't. But in the worst case, if they do, they really don't want to lose the access, right? They spent a lot of time, money, and effort to get it. So if my command and control channel at the top there gets compromised, maybe I still have my exfiltration channel and I still have my access to the network, or vice versa. The likelihood of both of them being compromised is not super high, at least. So I want to make sure at least one of those survives so I can maintain my access to the network. So that's great and all, except the sort of private sector, small to medium business, and even large enterprise world doesn't really understand that, right? If someone's got bad access to my network and a threat actor is doing something, sure, command and control, or they're stealing data, right? They're stealing PII or engineering diagrams or some other thing. But this was a really hard point to make, to understand that data paths are different. They're not the same thing. And the point I want to convey by this, or with this, is that as you're on the blue team and you're looking for these sorts of intrusions and you're looking potentially for these sorts of threat actors, even less sophisticated threat actors who do similar sort of behaviors, it's key to remember that there's very rarely one way in and out of the network for the bad guys. Right? And that seems really obvious. It's amazing, though, at least in my experience, how non-obvious that is to most people that are dealing with these sorts of things. Right? There are potentially multiple ways out, multiple ways that may not just involve implants on computers. They could involve people, they could involve cell phones, they could involve networking infrastructure, they can involve all sorts of crazy things depending on who you are. If you're a small to medium business in Akron, Ohio, maybe it doesn't really matter too much, but if you're a Fortune 500 financial institution, or you're an industrial control provider, or a critical infrastructure company, some other thing that could be targeted by serious state nexus actors, these are some of the key points to remember. And with that, that's me. That's also me on Twitter, so feel free to interact with me on there. And I have some time for questions. Are there any? This.
Yeah. My preceding question is, do I want this on the video or not?
Can we request them to stop recording during question and answer?
Or maybe I haven't had enough time to formulate my question.
That's fine. We'll give you time. Anyone else have any questions? Well, all right. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.